Hey, hi, it's good to see you again. Uh, it's Christmas 2020, and I thought I'd read you another story. Uh, it's a story that often we hear this time of year. It's called The Polar Express. I'm going to take the book jacket off. They kind of get in the way when I read the story. I get a little clumsy. Okay, Polar Express. Let's see. There it is. So sit back and enjoy. Chris von Allsburg's The Polar Express. There we go. Let's figure it out. Now, on Christmas Eve, many years ago, I lay quietly in my bed. I did not rustle the sheets. I breathed slowly and silently. I was listening for a sound a friend had told me that I'd never hear: the ringing of Santa's bells on his sleigh. There is no Santa, my friend had insisted, but I knew he was wrong. So late that night, Christmas Eve, I did hear sounds, though not of ringing bells. From outside came the sounds of hissing steam and squeaking metal, and I looked through my window and saw a train, standing perfectly still in front of my house. The train was wrapped in an apron of steam. Snowflakes fell lightly around it. And a conductor stood at the open door of one of the cars. He took a large pocket watch from his vest, and then he looked up at my window. I put on my slippers and my robe, and I tiptoed downstairs and out the door. "All aboard!" the conductor cried out. I ran up to him. "Well," he said, "are you coming?" "Where?" I asked. "Why, to the North Pole, of course," was his answer. "This is the Polar Express." I took his outstretched hand and he pulled me aboard. The train was filled with other children, all in their pajamas and nightgowns. Well, we sang Christmas carols and ate candies with nougat centers as white as snow, and we drank hot cocoa as thick and as rich as melted chocolate bars. Outside, the lights of towns and villages flickered in the distance as the Polar Express raced northward. Soon there was no more lights to be seen, and we traveled through cold, dark forests where lean wolves roamed and white-tailed rabbits hid as our train thundered through the quiet wilderness. We climbed mountains so high it seemed as if we would scrape the moon itself. But the Polar Express never slowed down. It went faster and faster. We ran along, rolling over peaks and through valleys like a car on a roller coaster. The mountains turned into hills and the hills to snow-covered plains. We crossed a barren desert of ice, the great polar ice cap. And then, far off in the distance, lights appeared. They looked like the lights of a strange ocean liner sailing on a frozen sea. There, said the conductor, is the North Pole. The North Pole. It was a huge city standing alone at the top of the world, filled with factories where every Christmas toy was made. Now, at first, we didn't see any elves. Well, said the conductor, the elves, they're gathering at the center of the city because that is where Santa will give the very first gift of Christmas. Oh, who's going to get it? Who receives the very first gift of Christmas? We asked. Well, the conductor said, he will choose one of you to receive the first gift of Christmas. Look, shouted one of the children, the elves! And yes, outside we saw hundreds of elves. As our train drew closer to the center of the North Pole, we slowed down to a crawl because the streets were so crowded with all of Santa's helpers. And then when the Polar Express could go no farther, we stopped. And the conductor led us outside. We pressed through the crowd to the edge of a large open circle. And there in front of us stood Santa's sleigh. The reindeer were excited. They pranced and paced, and the ringing of their silver sleigh bells that hung from their harnesses rang in my ears. It was like a magical sound, a sound I'd never heard. Across the circle, the elves moved apart, and there, walking right down through the center of the elves, came Santa Claus. The elves cheered wildly. Santa himself marched right up to us. He looked around and he pointed right at me. And he said, "Let's have this fellow here." And then Santa jumped up into his sleigh and the conductor lifted me up to Santa. I sat there on his knee and he asked me, "Now, what would you like for Christmas?" Now, what would you like for Christmas? Well, I knew that I could have any gift that I could imagine. But the thing I wanted most of all for Christmas was not inside Santa's giant bag. No, what I wanted more than anything else was one silver bell from Santa's sleigh. And when I asked for that, Santa smiled. He gave me a hug and told an elf to cut a bell from the reindeer's harness. The elf tossed it up to Santa, and then he stood up and, holding the bell high above his head, he called out, "The first gift of Christmas!" Just then a clock struck midnight, and the elves roared their approval. Santa handed the bell to me, and I put it in my bathrobe pocket. The conductor helped me down from the sleigh. Santa shouted out the reindeers' names and cracked his whip. His team charged forward and climbed and climbed and climbed into the air. Santa circled once above us and then disappeared into the cold, dark polar sky. As soon as we were back inside the Polar Express, the other children crowded around me and asked to see the bell, the sleigh bell. I reached down into my pocket but the only thing I felt was a hole in the bottom. I had lost the silver bell from Santa Claus' sleigh. "Oh, let's hurry up outside and let's look for it. Let's look," said the kids. But then the train gave a sudden jerk and we started moving. It was too late to look for my bell. We were on the way home. Too late to look for the sleigh bell. It broke my heart to lose that bell. And when the train reached my house, I sadly left the other children. And I stood at my doorway and waved goodbye. The conductor said something from the moving train, but I couldn't quite hear him. "What? What?" I yelled. He cupped both hands around his mouth and he cried out, "Merry Christmas!" He shouted, and the Polar Express let out a loud blast from his whistle and sped away. On Christmas morning, my little sister Sarah and I opened our presents. And when it looked as if everything had been unwrapped and opened, Sarah found one last small box behind the tree. It had my name on it. I opened it up. And inside was the silver bell. And there was a note. "Found this in the seat of my sleigh. Better fix that hole in your pocket." Signed, Mr. C. I shook the bell. It made the most beautiful sound my sister and I had ever heard. But my mother said, "Oh, that's too bad. It's broken." Yes, said my father, it's broken. No sound. It seems that when I'd shaken the bell, Sarah and I had heard the sound, but not my parents. Now, at one time, most of my friends could hear the bell, but as the years passed, it fell silent for many of them. In fact, all of them. And then one Christmas, even Sarah found that she could no longer hear its sweet sound. And though I've grown old now, the bell still rings for me, as it does for all who truly believe. And that's the Polar Express. And snip, snap, snout, this tale is all told out. Merry Christmas.